Okay, let's continue our turret. To start with, we'll clean up our scene a bit by rejoining these windows, and then we can move the low poly model from the UV collection back to the low poly collection, and then delete the UV. If we show the high poly, we should be good to go. So we need to save the file, give it a name like bake. In this video, we're going to be baking a color ID, an ambient occlusion, and a normal map. And there's a specific order we'll want to do this in. To make baking faster, we want to join our high poly parts together, but before that we want to set our colours for our ID map, which we'll be using to make a mask later on. In rendered mode, you can see the colour scheme I decided on at the end of the colour theory video. So we'll split our view for the shader editor, and we want to assign new base colours to anything we want to texture differently. These colours don't matter, just as long as they're all very different from each other. The base will be its own thing, but several other parts will share the same colour, so we can copy and paste them over to each one. It's best to make them really bright and distinct, as you'll be using these colours in Photoshop to select all of the parts that you want to use the same material. So just going for a bright blue on all these metal parts. An orange for the handles, ammo drum, and the front of the gun. And then for the sides, I think a green might be good. And we can just Control C and Control V on each part just to paste that same colour over. Just going to check that bit under here. Yeah, that's part of the metal, so that's fine. Okay, so just going to join these views back, so we don't need those split anymore. And then we can join all the parts together. Now, when we join the parts together, certain parts of the model are going to fuse on the bevel shader. So if you look at this example here, the cylinder is flush to the cube underneath, and they've both got a bevel shader applied. And you can see that when I join the objects together, a bevel's formed between both. That's fine for this example, but we don't want that on our actual model, because that will make certain bevels, such as panel lines, disappear altogether. And if they disappear, they won't get baked when we do our normal map. So if we go into rendered view, you can see on the front of the gun here, we had a panel line that went around this section. And you can see with all the objects merged together, you can't see that line anymore. So to fix that, we just need to move some of the faces away from each other. So just Shift H to hide the rest of the model, and then we can just select all these inside faces. Selecting this on both sides. If we go into side view, we can just move that forward slightly on the y-axis. And then if we unhide everything and go into shaded view, you can see we've got a black line around there now, so we can see where the bevel shader is a separate thing. We just need to shrink the part in the middle now. We just scale this in slightly on the z-axis. And just try and keep the gap around where this panel line is even all the way around. It's a bit easier to see in shaded view. Rendered view, sorry. If we select all of this part with L, we can Shift H, and although it doesn't look like it, it basically hides the rest of the model from being selectable. You see they get a nice thick line that will get caught on the normal map. For good measure, we can go around and do that on the other parts as well, such as the barrels on the front of the gun. Especially as we're having a normal map that covers the first, the geometry on the low poly covers the first inset on these cylinders and goes all the way into the middle. Just going to undo that. We need to change over to individual origins, and then when we scale them, they'll scale relative to where the center of where they are. And again, it's just so that the bevel shader doesn't merge them together. Another part we can do is the grille down here at the front. Go into front view, select the whole piece, and then just scale that down. Doesn't have to be a lot, just so that the faces aren't flushed together. And then lastly, just want to do these handles in the base. And for these, I'm going to use a shrink fatten, which I've got set to Shift-Alt-S. So just going to scale those down slightly. Okay. Just going to save that, and we're ready to set up our first bake, which is the ambient occlusion. So I'm going to split the view into a shader editor and an image editor at the top. And I'm just going to rename the high poly and low poly. It's just a step for later on. So add a material to our low poly. And I'm going to go up to the render settings and into the bake drop down. Now I'm going to change the bake type to ambient occlusion. Put a check-in selected to active. And I know from some trial and error that I've done, these values to put in 0.015 and 0.5. Then in the image editor, we need to make a new map for ambient occlusion. And I'm going to make this at 4K. And then in the shader editor, we need a image texture with that same AO material in, and set it to non-color, because an ambient occlusion map is just black and white information. Next, we're going to select the high poly and the low poly, and we can press bake. I'm going to skip the whole bake process, and you can see that map's appeared there in the top. And again, I already know from some trial and error there's no errors on that. But if we plug that into the base color, we can have a look at it on the actual model. If you do get problems with it, it's the extrusion or ray distance that you need to adjust. But that's actually come out really clean. And it really just helps pick out the smaller details. Remember to save your image, because it doesn't get saved automatically. If you try and leave Blender, it will give you a message about internal maps. But as we're baking 3 maps, we don't want to overwrite it accidentally. So on to the next one. We're going to duplicate both the high poly and low poly, and then move them to a new collection where we're going to explode the models. So we've got both of those in that folder now. We can hide the originals, and I'm just going to work on these one at a time. So we're going to select this whole base, And I'm just going to move it down on the z-axis by 2 units, so just GZ minus 2. I'm just using L to select linked material. Same with this part, GZ minus 1. And we just have to remember what we did for each part. Doing it this way, it's quite easy to remember. And because we're going to need the high poly to match up exactly with where the low poly parts are. So this bracket, if we do G, Y2, and then use Shift R to repeat it, so it just moves it forward 2 at a time. And we're just separating out the pieces so that when we bake the normal map with the cage, we don't get any overlaps. Some of the parts might need a bigger cage around them than others. Okay, that's all the parts of the low poly separated. Next we need to hide the low poly and reveal the high poly in the exploded collection, and then basically just move all those parts by the same amount. So the base minus 2, and then the metal base will be minus 1. But with that, we need to also select all the handles and bolts as well that are basically part of that body that are going to get baked down. Now if I select from the side here, you'll see that I'm actually selecting the face on the bottom of the upper bracket that holds the gun. So I'm going to need to select slightly lower than that, and then just use select linked on the top part. It's just so I can select all the bolts in one go. So again, GZ minus 1. With the ammo barrel, just remembering to select the handle as well. GY minus 2. The bracket minus 2, 4 or 6, can't remember. That's 2, that's 4, that's 6, so that's 6 across. The main gun, we want all these parts and the front and the 2 barrels on the front. And we're just going to move those forward. These wheels on the side, we're going to need, we need to select all the bolts. So I'm just going to, and I'm using box select X-ray for this. So that will select all the bolts on both sides, and then we can just press L to select the whole of the wheel as well. And just I'm going to move those up 2 units. And you can see I've forgotten to move forward, or forgot to select that part on the back of the gun that lines up with the ammo drum. So they're all now in exactly the same places as the low poly. And we're now going to duplicate the exploded low poly and move it to another collection called cage. And it's important to name this one because we'll need to find it easily in a list later on. If we give it a material, it's already got the same one as the low poly, so if we just remove that and add a new one, we can go down to viewport display and change the color to anything. I like to use a bright red color. Then if we hide the low poly and show the other one, we can expand the red cage and so until it completely engulfs the high poly. So we're just going to select each part of it and use shrink fatten, which I've got set to Shift Alt S, until it's just slightly bigger than the geometry underneath, which you can see by the grey material. So as you can see on some of these parts you need to do it a bit more than others. And we're just going around all the parts of the low poly cage now. And if we need to, we can see where it's not covering the high poly because there'll be grey poking through. Most of these parts are quite simple to do. There's one or two that I'll need to adjust manually, but I'll show you that in a second. This being one of them. So you can see on the part that joins the upper part of the ammo bracket, this part isn't quite right. So I'm going to change the transform orientation to normal, and if I move that part up on the local Z-axis, and the same with this, if I select these faces and move them up, it just covers that last little bit with red so that it's not going to cause any errors. The pivot wheels, they're already covered in red, to be honest, so I don't think I actually need to do anything with those. Just checking that the geometry is still there underneath. It is. And same with this gun. Just increase it slightly, covers most of it, and then you can just see there's a few errors here and there. So these parts underneath, they're just poking through the side ever so slightly. So if I select this row of verts and then scale them on the x-axis, that will cover that. And then here on the front, we just need to move that front part there that's in grey. If we just select the geometry behind it and move that forward on the y-axis, once we've changed it back to global, and you can see that grey will get covered up. If we look around the model, we can see everything's covered. When you are zoomed out at distance, it can start to flicker through. It's just because some of it's very close to the surface. Okay, now we can set this up for baking the normal. And it's pretty similar to the ambient occlusion, so we don't need the cage showing, just the high poly and low poly. And if we just unplug the ambient occlusion, we can duplicate the image texture. And we're just going to add a new one up top for normal. Still at 4K, so we can still just use that. Change the one in the shader editor to normal, and again non-color. Non-color is very important on the normal setting, otherwise it just displays very strangely. And we want to select the cage and use the cage that we've named earlier. The ray distance can stay the same. Select the high poly, low poly, change the bake type to normal, and as long as we've got the image selected in the shader editor, we can click bake, and there's a normal map. Now there are some errors you can see there in yellow, but those are places where the geometry is supposed to overlap. So it is a bake error, but it's not one anywhere you can actually see it on the model. So I'm going to ignore that. And if I put a normal map in the shader editor, I can plug all that in. And then if we look at if we hide the exploded version, the low poly that's all still together, it's got the same material on it. So if we darken the material a bit, we'll be able to see if our normal map's working. It's looking pretty good. I think this the adjustments we made for the panel lines have really worked well. They've been picked up really nicely. Details on the ammo drum look really good. Had to do all the bolts and handles. Now there is a slight error here on the side. As you can see, those indents there, for some reason the top one curves up, so it's catching the light at a weird angle, and that will be to do with the angle of the cage. But we can fix that up in the next video. Okay, I'm just going to unplug the normal map for now. And then finally we need to make the color ID map. So I'm just going to duplicate the AO again and delete out the map that's in there. Let's make a new map at the top. Again, it's 4K. And this one we can keep it as sRGB. Over in the bake type, we can change this to diffuse. And if we uncheck influence, we can uncheck direct and indirect colour because we just want the colour for this. One thing I forgot to do earlier, which I've sort of done off screen, is you need to turn off the metallic and the ambient occlusion on all the materials. Otherwise you get shading and reflections, which you don't want. You just want these to be flat colours. And I'm just going to move this over into Photoshop now. And if we load in the UV map that we made earlier, that we exported in a previous video, we can paste that over the top of the baked colour ID map. And I'm just going to, I've inverted the UV so you can see it a bit easier. And I'm just going to go around all the parts of the model that are in black and make them green, because that is what that part of the model should have been coloured as. In the next video, we'll be selecting these colours to make masks so we can procedurally texture it. Back in Blender, we can plug in the normal and the ambient occlusion to see how they're working together. And we can really see how nice the details are getting picked out by the normal and ambient combined. So the bolts actually look like they're sitting in those holes. Barrels look like they're sunken in properly. The panel lines are nice and sharp. We've shaded in all the crevices. Bolts on the side of the wheels look good. We've even got the join where the ammo drum meets the gun. And it's literally just fixing up the normal map on those side elements. See you in the next one.